Well, hi there, it's Polly here with Mr. Snoots and a cool LGBTQ miniskirt and a pirate flag in the background. As part of my transgender history project, I have already covered a history of modern sexology. But one thing that you'll hear from the trans community all the time is that we have always been here. Historically, there have always been transgender people. For those of you who aren't aware of this, let's just do a little dive into that. We'll look at where we've been and why there are efforts to destroy us now. Okay, I live in Perth, Australia. Australia is home to the oldest contiguous human culture on Earth, our First Nations people. You might know them as Australian Aboriginals. That is not really a term that we use much anymore, but their history on this continent goes back at minimum 60,000 years. It may go back for 100,000. Aboriginal Australian cultures trace their lineages and their stories back to the dreaming, which is a time when sort of spirit and a spirit world and a mortal world were beginning to intermingle and also pull apart, and so various god-style mythic creatures manifested upon the earth and people were created and so forth. Since the dreaming, First Nations peoples of Australia have had many different modes of gender expression. These are still preserved today. Both people born female who then assume the genders and gender roles of males, people who are born male and ascend to the gender roles and presentation of females. Also, androgynous presentations, intersex presentations. There was also a great deal of respect for women who chose not to marry men and who instead lived with women, either in their own societies or as sometimes female, essentially married couples. Male married couples as well. This was an integral part of the culture of many different tribal groups and is preserved today. In modern kind of trans parlance, transgender First Nations Australians will refer to each other usually as sister girls and brother boys. And in general parlance, trans mob. Mob is kind of First Nations, essentially, slang reference to any group of themselves. The oldest living human culture on Earth celebrates this, but it was almost crushed out of them by the colonial British. So, when you hear about transgender people in history, you'll hear many different references to different religions and different finds come up. So let's touch on some of these briefly. And let's also touch on this Western civilization thing. The kind of idiots that bang on about Western civilization do not know what it is. And they also kind of cast about and try and draw it in from all sorts of stupid sources that they don't understand. This is what annoys me about right-wing people. But the two earliest civilizations of which we really have any real records are the Sumerian civilizations in Mesopotamia, and also some of the very early Indus Valley civilizations in what you would now call Pakistan, but part of the Indian subcontinent. We cannot translate the writing of the Indus Valley civilization. They left some artwork which we can't really translate that well. but we can sure as hell read Sumerian, and we can see their artwork, and they left us a wealth of statues. So, the oldest known author in the world is a woman, and she was a high priestess of Inanna, and she left a huge wealth of prayers and devotional poems, and also love poems behind her, hundreds of them. Because their records were in clay, in cuneiform, they have survived. And because this was a very literate people, they made copies of poems and copies of religious statue works, which then went to multiple sites, which is why we've got so many. Inanna was cast very much as a supreme god. Inanna was female. Inanna was a god of weather and storms. As such, could be invoked for fertility and through rain and growth, and also through war and therefore power. A substantial number of Inanna's priests were transgender. They were men who entirely wore women's clothing. They adopted female names, and this is how they lived. Now, a thing that you'll find as a theme is that many transgender people in some of these civilizations, their transgenderism either qualifies them for special status in spiritual terms, or is limited mostly to spirituality, only within that framework. But this is ancient Sumer. This continues. Inanna later morphs into later goddesses in the regions such as Astarte, goddess of sex, drugs and rock and roll. And there continues to be a transgender priesthood through into Babylonian times, through into biblical times. This is just seen as part of life. We don't know that transgender individuals were only limited to within that religious framework, but because of the way their records are recorded, they were mostly concerned with either business or religion. So it's the religious records that we have. Now, I've recently come back from travelling India, and in between fighting off transphobic assaults, I also found myself in some strange positions, because transgender women in India are sacred to some of the Hindu deities, particularly Lord Shiva. Married a transgender goddess called Parvati. Parvati is sometimes depicted as a statue that is male on one half and female on the other, or is depicted as a woman that has male genitalia. Shiva also changed to a woman, and as one of their avatars lived as a woman, and so this gender fluidity is very, very, very common in Hindu myth. And remember, these are people whose myth cycle has come down from Indo-European early cultures. So this was probably a very, very common theme in those very early people that were expanding down from the steppes to colonize northern India, move into places like Anatolia and into Europe. You can also thank them for things like the horse and the chariot, I guess. But so I actually had to perform blessings a few times while I was in India, because I was seen as sacred and was asked for them. In the south, as it turns out, a great many of the temples there, long ago, it was their pride and their joy to have transgender women in the temples. They became the senior priestesses responsible both for the maintenance of the temples, but also it was they who preserved the traditions of classical dance. If you really wanted to learn classical dance, really, you studied under a transgender woman at one of these temples, you'll notice a theme. Again, British colonial forces crushed this habit, made it almost impossible to be transgender, and this practice of having transgender women in charge of temples survived only in very out of the way temples in valleys and so on where the British couldn't be bothered monitoring. It's coming back now, but when I was in that area, very often you'd get local mystics, often, you know, stark naked except for a coating of ash or whatever. They would always make sure they caught my eye and gave me a firm nod, hail fellow traveller. And when I spoke to some, they were, and when they found out that I was a dancer and had in fact been doing performances there in India, they were, of course, you know, this is what you people do. You preserve culture. You are the lawgivers. That is also something from Australian First Nations culture, by the way. The transgender population were the keepers of law. Very often the ones that remembered the stories and preserved the Dreamtime stories. So, India is one of the oldest, again, continuous civilizations in the world. This celebration of different gender presentations was very common there in the Hindu population. And not just transgender male and female, which was, you know, rare. We're not a big part of the population, we're always going to be tiny, but we were there. And also androgynous presentations, intersex, all falls under that general veil of social acceptance. Our presence was acknowledged. We were just a thing in the world. We were something that is no more remarkable than, you know, rain, clouds, or the fact that the grass grows. When Muslim cultures came into the area, we began to get some problems. Again, this is a theme we'll return to. Ancient Greece. Now, you'll find a lot of hints of transgenderism and androgynous presentations in Greek mythology. So you'll find things like Tiresias, who was the blind oracle that, for instance, told Oedipus about his fate. He changed from male to female, back and forth. And there are many different versions of how this happened and how they lived their life, but this is quite common. There are the cults of Hermaphroditus and Aphroditus. Hermaphroditus was a male that changed to a woman, or rather had, often is depicted male genitals, female breasts, etc. Aphroditus is a male version of the same Aphroditus is often depicted with a beard and dressed in male clothing, but has clearly has like female body parts, etc. Very, very, very common. There were a number of mystery cults of which we know very little, because the thing about those mystery cults is they weren't allowed to speak or record what happened in them, and so they didn't. But there are a number of cults with this, many of which were female oriented. It gave women a powerful voice in religious practice. But the most famous of these, of course, is the Sibylline cult. Now, you will hear about this a lot in its Roman manifestation. The Sibylline cult was one of the mystery cults that the Greeks had. These were cults usually specific to a particular part of their mythology. They had their own secret initiations, and then they told their own secret versions of these stories. They had their own rites, their own initiations. They had celebratory days. Some of these celebratory days were public, like the Hyacinthos cult in Sparta, where it was like a 3-day festival, mourning the death of Hyacinthos, but also celebrating his rebirth. So the Sibylline cult was, unusual in that its priests, known by the Romans as Galae, were transgender, and the initiates were hardcore. You could be part of the Sibylline cult, and the adherents would generally cross-dress into female clothing. When it crossed to Rome, they would dress in female Greek clothing. The initiates, they had a very, very public initiation ceremony where there was much celebration and much raging about the streets, much like a Bacchanalian cult, which was also one of the mystery cults. There was, I think there was quite a bit of use of various psychotics, because at the height of this, each of these initiates performed self-castration and self-penectomy to try and create that female silhouette. They then run through the streets, bleeding into the streets, because this is their first menstruation. This is their passage into womanhood. I'm very glad for modern surgical procedures, aren't you? But this cult lasted for centuries. It was present in ancient Greece, and it was present in Rome. Now, in Rome, it actually became quite an important state cult. It was present everywhere. Galae were seen as decidedly strange, but their public presence was completely tolerated. But ancient Rome, which we now move on to, is a very interesting piece. So, again, those Western culture people, they will bang on about Rome. A lot of Rome is cribbed from Greece, and as we saw, and as anyone knows, Greece was gay as fuck. My God, the modern gay parades wish they were only 1/10 that gay. Essentially, most people lived on a bisexual spectrum and were absolutely expected to have same-sex relationships through their life at different periods. It was the norm. This tended to be the norm in, you'll start to notice the theme, any non-monotheistic state. Rome, however, had a definite state cult, Jupiter Optimus Maximus. All other gods were very much subordinate. The state cult was Jupiter, and whereas other religiosity was allowed, it was subjugated to the official state cult. This is where early Christianity and so on ran into trouble. Their problem was they would not sacrifice to the official cults of Jupiter, and where a emperor was divine would not sacrifice to the emperor. This was actually their fault. This is why they were being chased about the place. But again, a incredibly bisexual culture, but they were in the grip of an idea of gender binary. However, presentation of diverse gender was extremely common. Hermaphroditic statues were common household wear. In no way pornographic. Often they might be displaying tension between the sexes and so on. But it looks like, again, that thought of transgenderism being spiritual was a part of this. There were things like statues of Marcus Aurelius being remodeled after his death to have a female body. Transitioning from male to female was a divine attribute. An interesting one is the Emperor Elchbaeus. So I will call her she, because that's what she wanted to be called. Conceived of herself entirely as a woman, married a charioteer, and apparently it was a loving marriage, not a... because Nero had some strange moments as well, but no, this was obviously a very deeply, profoundly sincere desire to be a woman. This emperor, or shall we say empress, offered a fortune to any surgeon that could actually create in them a vagina. Not just, castration, penectomy. Can you give me a vagina? So now you will see the behavior of this poor soul when you get people like Gibbon's Fall of the Roman Emperor. This will be shown as what the heights of their degeneracy were. It's always played as degeneracy. Put that one in mind off to the side. Now, the actual medical text at the time, interestingly enough, the Hippocratic texts, actually believed that there were fluids in the body, and there were essentially masculine and feminine fluids, and that these were present in different amounts in different people. That is how you were born. And if you have a predominance of female fluids, then you are female, and if you have a predominance of male fluids, then you are male. But there is a balance to these. Sometimes there is more of one and part of the other, and this is where we get more effeminate men, more masculine women, and sometimes it's a complete intermix, and this is where you get intersex people and essentially transgender people who have a physical presentation one way but wish a gender presentation the other way. This was the medical theory that lasted for hundreds of years. This went from what? 4th and 5th century BC to 1500 AD. For about 2,000 years, the accepted medicine says people can have different gender presentations based on their biology. Fantastic. So, the interesting about I always find about Rome is that, again, the Western culture enthusiasts, they always think they're Roman. It's like, no, you're not. Not even close. Because they seem to be banging on about, we're Vikings, etc. No, these are all Germanic cultures, except they're not Germanic cultures, they're Gothic cultures. Germanic was a very specific, narrow band of people who got very thoroughly stomped by the incoming Goths from the steppes. Gothic cultures, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, any other kind of Goths, all hail rhetoric, our chief, they came from the steppes. These guys are coming in from like Uzbekistan and Crimea. And a architectural examination of the Kurgan, the burial mounds of the Scythian people who lived for many thousands of years in that area, very frequently turns up graves of people who have been buried with either female dress but carrying male weapons, or male dress but carrying female tools. Some of these are thought to have been essentially warrior women. Others look like they might be males who are being buried with the tools of a life lived as a female, and vice versa. So again, gender presentations varied. You will find this all through the cultures of that region. In fact, let's take a jump away from Western Europe for a moment. You'll find it all through ancient Peruvian culture as well, and these are still celebrated in religious rituals today, and in cultural rituals such as many of the parades. There are many varied gender presentations. In essence, every single culture on Earth has had multiple gender presentations, and particularly transgender presentations. So it's interesting, why has this Roman gender binary fixation developed in a world where they are actually recognizing a spiritual layer to gender presentation, where they have a profoundly bisexual culture, and where they have cults of very, very visible transgender people. I'm a historian, and I begin to see a thread. Anytime a monotheistic or largely monotheistic state arises, it becomes largely based on its physical power, which in a primitive society, and I'm going to say that as anything that doesn't make its own steam engines, begins to celebrate a cult of masculinity, because it basically wants to encourage people to believe it is virtuous to kill other people. You'll find this cult of masculinity spreads very, very strongly, and in doing that it begins to publicly reject anything that they feel is a feminine aspect. Roman culture rejected those very meaningful and powerful male-to-male sexual relationships that the Greeks had. To the Greeks, the male-to-male sexual relations that you had lasted a lifetime, and these were your most dedicated friends. In Roman culture, this is seen only as a side thing for pleasure, and is never presented in public. Male is seen as better, as dominant, as powerful, and female as lesser. And so anything that crosses that barrier, and anything that says that you can have these mystic male attributes and essentially cast them away to become female, or morph them to become female, and the other way round, tends to particularly be trans, male to female, that goes against the ideology of the cult of masculinity, and this is where it draws state ire, and the state begins to police these boundaries. You will see this in the Islamic religion. In pre-Islamic Arab cultures, there was a great deal of homosexuality and mixed gender presentation. Particularly, there were actually cross-dressing and transgender individuals, famously, and indeed Muhammad knew some, and he was fine with them. And these were also people that you could just quite happily kind of, leave with your wives and daughters, because it's acknowledged they don't have any interest in them. They're more interested in figuring out where you got that dress than pouncing upon them. And this remained so until Islam morphed from essentially like Christianity, a communist-y religion that says there should be no rich and powerful, we must share all between us, and became a tool of the newly arisen states. And that's when you get that male supremacy, gender binary cult begins. And now this ancient tradition that they have of multiple gender presentations, and particularly transgender presentations, that is suppressed. Christianity does much the same in Europe. As Christianity is brought in as a unifying force into the Roman Empire, the last semblances of official toleration for transgender people vanish, because Christianity is morphed into a tool for state control and enforcement of a status quo. And this is what we see in monotheisms. They exist as a form of populist control for the state, and as such they reinforce gender norms in service of the gender cults of the state. It's very present in Judaism as well. Judaism is a very male-centric cult, and it has always stressed that superiority of male over female, and this is where you get the complete bullshit from the Old Testament Bible, these tortured people. Because when you start desperately, and there is an air of desperation, desperately putting things in a Bible, in any religious document to try and outlaw transgenderism, crush transgenderism, you are fighting against human nature. You are fighting against a part of the population that clearly has always been here. If you are having to legislate against something time and time again, that means that thing is recurrent. That means that thing is a constant. So, all of these cultures, and through all this history, here we've been. And yet, it's only now that this is coming out. There's a reason for this. Colonialism. The European order, in which I will include American, relied on the absolute destruction and subjugation of all native cultures before the supposedly racial superiority of the colonizer. Go out and do some reading on this if you want your hair raised, but this is essentially its core. And a huge part of that colonization project is the destruction of native histories, and then a recasting of those histories in the mold approved of by the colonizer. You aren't going to get real Amerindian histories, but you are going to get the tale of Hiawatha. The colonizers come in and discover the culture of the colonized and pass it through a Western European filter in which the gender binary is supreme, so that the transgender histories are lost. You will still see this in archaeology. When a tomb of someone who has ambiguous sexual presentations is found, someone is found that's got grave goods from multiple genders, or you will find a skeleton that seems to be somewhat at odds with the tools that it's been buried with. It will be presented as an anomaly, as a mystery. It is never simply announced that, we found a person that has some varied gender presentation by the looks of it. That still remains a thing that is crushed down. We are having to reassert the truth, the archaeological truth, because archaeology has been used as such a tool for colonization. These primitive cultures that the noble West are digging up, it's only through the discovery and uncovery and the filter of the West that these barbarians have any meaning. You see how that works? So this is why you'll find all of these American native cultures that have these amazing gender presentations. Sometimes they'll enunicate them so that many of them will have like 5 different gender presentations. Some of them have way more than that. But they were gone, never mentioned, until now, where they're being dug out. And this is part of the whole transgender history project. And this is why this is important, what I'm telling you now, and this is why it's important that you just use this as a Kickstarter for having a look into these things yourself. We have a history, and that history goes way, way, way past the beginnings of human civilization. We have always been here. There has been a dedicated effort from state structures to deny our existence because it does not fit with the state myths of male gender supremacy, effectively. And the actual transgender and gender diverse histories of so many cultures across the world have been deliberately suppressed and destroyed by colonial powers in an effort to essentially pass their histories through a filter of their own gender binary in order to basically refashion and reclaim them, rework them. Old glories must be played down, except as a demonstration of how corrupt these people became, so therefore we're saving them. White man's burden. We must save these corrupt individuals because only white guys know what's truly good for everybody. When you hear a transphobic person talking about Western culture, blah, 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 destruction of civilization, that is what they are saying. They are saying no people in the history of all time have any value whatsoever, except for essentially angry white guys. And they are willing to lie heartily to support that position. So we are digging this history out. We are finding it. Every day there's more found. They look again at the paintings at the Minoan Palace in Knossos and find that there are actually paintings on those walls that were taken as female that may be actually male bodies depicted in female clothing, and vice versa. But no one ever thought to look at them that way before, until now, until we're questioning. We have to reclaim these histories. And the reason we have to reclaim them is that the right-wing position is that we have never existed before now, and therefore we do not belong on this earth, and therefore our destruction is mandated. This is what they're saying. And this is why they fight against the rediscovery of true human history, a history where certainly most people in the world have always presented male and female, but there's always been that few who are different and acknowledged. They exist. No one closes their eyes and pretend that they don't. They're there. But that's always been there. We've always been here. Always, always. And it is not for a bunch of angry right-wing ideologues to suddenly decide that we won't. We will survive their attempts at extermination because human nature is to throw up multiple gender presentations and to create transgender identities. We've always been here, and we always will. Anyway, much peace to everyone out there. Look after yourselves. Much love to you all.